A sweltering summer evening in 1993. The sun is setting over a desolate stretch of highway, casting long shadows across the asphalt. A passing motorist notices something unusual ahead. There, parked at an odd angle on the shoulder, sits a police patrol car. Its red and blue lights are still flashing, cutting through the growing darkness like a desperate cry for help. The engine is running. The driver's door hangs wide open as if someone had stepped out in a hurry and simply vanished into thin air. But where is the officer? As the motorist approaches cautiously, a chill runs down their spine. The scene before them doesn't make sense. This isn't just an abandoned vehicle. It's a mystery that will haunt investigators for decades to come. Inside that patrol car, police would discover something so disturbing, so completely unexpected, that even veteran officers who had seen everything would struggle to comprehend what they were looking at. What started as a simple missing person case would evolve into one of the most baffling and sinister unsolved mysteries in law enforcement history. Tonight we're going to take you inside this chilling case. We'll explore the final hours of a dedicated police officer, the desperate search that followed his disappearance, and the shocking discovery that changed everything. This is a story about duty, danger, and the terrifying reality that sometimes those who protect us can vanish without a trace. But most importantly, this is a story about what happens when the truth is buried so deep that it takes years to claw its way back to the surface. And when it finally does emerge, it reveals something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The abandoned patrol car on that lonely highway wasn't just a crime scene, it was a warning. A message that some secrets are worth killing for and some people are willing to do anything to keep them buried. So buckle in, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about justice, corruption, and the thin blue line that's supposed to protect us all. Before we dive into the events that would forever change one small community, we need to understand the man at the center of this mystery. Officer David Marshall wasn't just a badge number or a statistic. He was a human being with hopes, dreams, and people who loved him. David had been with the department for 8 years. At 32, he was considered one of the most reliable officers on the force. His colleagues knew him as someone who took the job seriously, maybe too seriously sometimes. He was the kind of cop who would spend his own time helping elderly residents change flat tires or checking on local businesses during his off hours just to make sure everything was secure. His supervisor, Captain Robert Hayes, would later describe David as the officer you'd want responding if your family was in trouble. He had a reputation for being thorough, honest, and unafraid to dig deeper when something didn't feel right. These qualities would prove to be both his greatest strength and perhaps his ultimate downfall. At home, David was a devoted husband to his wife Sarah and father to 2 young children, Emma, age 7, and Michael, just 4 years old. Sarah often worried about the dangers of police work, but David would reassure her that their small town rarely saw serious crime. "The most excitement I get is breaking up bar fights on Saturday nights," he would joke. But David had bigger aspirations. He had recently been accepted into the State Police Academy's detective training program. He dreamed of moving up the ranks, maybe even joining the State Bureau of Investigation someday. He was scheduled to begin his detective training just 2 weeks after his disappearance. Those who knew David well understood that beneath his calm exterior was an officer who genuinely believed in justice. He had grown up in the same community he now served, and he took that responsibility personally. When local residents had concerns, they often sought out David specifically because they trusted him to listen and take action. His partner, Officer Janet Mills, remembers David as someone who noticed details others missed. He had this way of seeing patterns, she recalls. If something was off even just slightly, David would pick up on it. He'd say, "Janet, something's not right here," and he'd be proven right every single time. This attention to detail had served him well throughout his career. He had solved several burglary cases by noticing inconsistencies in witness statements. He had helped break up a drug distribution ring by recognizing that certain vehicles appeared in different neighborhoods at suspicious times. His arrest record was impressive, but more importantly, his cases rarely fell apart in court because his investigative work was so thorough. David was also known for his integrity. In a department where some officers might look the other way for friends or influential community members, David treated everyone equally. This had occasionally created tension with colleagues who felt he was too rigid, but it had earned him respect from the community and his supervisors. His dedication to the job sometimes worried his family. Sarah would often find him at the kitchen table late at night, reviewing case files or writing detailed reports. "You don't have to save the world, Dave," she would tell him. But that's exactly what he was trying to do, one case at a time. What his family and colleagues didn't know was that David had recently stumbled onto something that was keeping him awake at night for entirely different reasons. Something that would soon put him in danger from the very people he trusted most. July 15, 1993, started like any other day for Officer David Marshall. He kissed his wife goodbye at 5:30 a.m., ruffled his children's hair as they slept, and headed to the station for what should have been a routine shift. But looking back, there were subtle signs that this day would be anything but ordinary. David's shift began at 6 a.m. with the usual briefing. According to the duty sergeant's notes, nothing unusual was discussed. A few overnight burglary reports, a domestic disturbance that had been resolved, and reminders about the upcoming county fair security assignments. David seemed his normal self, asking clarifying questions about the burglary reports and volunteering to take extra patrols in the affected neighborhoods. His first few hours on duty were unremarkable. He responded to a minor traffic accident, wrote 2 speeding tickets, and checked on an elderly woman who had called about suspicious activity near her home. The suspicious activity turned out to be raccoons getting into her garbage, and David helped her secure the lids before moving on. But around 10 a.m., something changed. David made an unusual radio call to dispatch, asking them to run additional background checks on several local businesses. When pressed for details, he simply said he was following up on some inconsistencies he had noticed. The dispatcher, thinking nothing of it, ran the checks and radioed back with clean results. At 11:45 a.m., David stopped for coffee at Murphy's Diner, a local establishment where officers often grabbed quick meals. Waitress Linda Murphy remembers the visit clearly because David seemed distracted, constantly glancing at his notepad and checking his watch. He usually chatted with the other customers, Linda recalls, but that day he kept to himself. He looked worried about something. What Linda didn't mention to investigators until years later was that David had asked her an odd question. He wanted to know if she had noticed any unusual activity at the warehouses on the outskirts of town, particularly late-night truck traffic. When she said she hadn't, David simply nodded and left without finishing his coffee. David's next radio check-in came at 1:30 p.m. He reported that he was conducting routine patrols in the industrial district, an area that wasn't typically part of his assigned route. When dispatch questioned this, David explained that he was investigating reports of possible theft from construction sites. No such reports had been filed, but dispatch assumed David was being proactive as usual. At 3:15 p.m., David stopped at Peterson's gas station to refuel his patrol car. Station owner Bill Peterson remembers David seeming nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to approach. He kept checking his mirrors, Peterson later told investigators. When I asked if everything was okay, he just said he was having one of those days where everything felt off. Peterson also recalled that David made several phone calls from the payphone outside the station. He couldn't hear the conversations, but he noticed David writing something down in his notepad after each call. When investigators later checked phone records, they found that David had called the state police barracks, the county sheriff's office, and a number that belonged to a reporter at the regional newspaper. David's final radio contact came at 4:42 p.m. He reported his location as Highway 67, about 15 miles outside of town, and stated that he was following up on a lead. When dispatch asked for clarification, David's response was cryptic. "I need to check something out. I'll radio back within the hour." That was the last time anyone heard Officer David Marshall's voice. What investigators would later piece together from witness statements and security camera footage was a timeline that raised more questions than it answered. Between 4:42 p.m. and 6:30 p.m., when his patrol car was discovered, David had somehow ended up on a desolate stretch of highway that was miles from where he had last reported his location. Several witnesses would come forward in the following days, each adding pieces to a puzzle that never quite fit together. A farmer reported seeing David's patrol car parked behind an abandoned barn around 5 p.m. A truck driver claimed to have seen the same patrol car speeding down Highway 67 around 5:30 p.m., but going in the opposite direction from where it was eventually found. Most disturbing of all was the testimony of Margaret Hendricks, an elderly woman who lived in a farmhouse near where the patrol car was discovered. She reported hearing what sounded like an argument around 6 p.m., followed by the sound of car doors slamming. When she looked out her window, she saw David's patrol car sitting on the shoulder with its lights flashing, but she was too far away to see if anyone was inside. By the time Margaret worked up the courage to investigate, something she would regret for the rest of her life. The patrol car had been discovered by the passing motorist, and David Marshall had vanished into thin air. When motorist James Richardson approached the abandoned patrol car at 6:35 p.m., he had no idea he was about to become the first witness to one of the most perplexing crime scenes in local history. What he found defied all logic and would haunt investigators for decades to come. The patrol car sat at an awkward angle on the shoulder of Highway 67, its front wheels still pointed toward the road, as if David had pulled over quickly. The engine was running, fuel gauge showing nearly full. The red and blue emergency lights were flashing in their hypnotic pattern, casting eerie shadows across the surrounding countryside as daylight began to fade. The driver's door was wide open, hanging like a mouth frozen mid-scream. David's duty hat lay on the ground beside the car as if it had fallen or been knocked off during some kind of struggle. But there were no signs of a struggle, no scuff marks in the dirt, no disturbed vegetation, no indication that any kind of altercation had taken place. Richardson approached cautiously, calling out to see if the officer was injured and needed help. When he received no response, he peered into the vehicle. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. David's radio handset was lying on the passenger seat, its coiled cord stretched taut as if it had been yanked from its mount. The radio was still squawking with periodic dispatcher calls, asking for David's location and status. His clipboard, usually secured to the dashboard, was on the floor with papers scattered around it. But it was what Richardson saw on the driver's seat that truly disturbed him. There, placed almost deliberately in the center of the seat, was David's service weapon, still in its holster, unused. No police officer would voluntarily leave their weapon behind, especially not in a situation dangerous enough to require them to abandon their vehicle. Richardson immediately used the patrol car's radio to call for backup, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what he had found. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with police cars, ambulances, and emergency vehicles. The quiet stretch of highway had become a chaotic hub of flashing lights and urgent radio chatter. Captain Hayes arrived within 20 minutes, and what he saw troubled him even more than Richardson's description had suggested. Hayes had been a police officer for over 20 years, and he had never encountered a scene quite like this one. Everything about it felt wrong, staged somehow, as if someone wanted it to appear that David had simply vanished into thin air. The first responders immediately began searching the surrounding area. The highway was flanked by dense woods on one side and open farmland on the other. If David had been injured or disoriented, he couldn't have gone far, but after 2 hours of intensive searching with flashlights and calling his name, they found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no blood. No indication that David had ever left the immediate vicinity of his patrol car. As the search continued into the night, investigators began examining the patrol car more closely. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. The vehicle showed no signs of damage, no indication that it had been involved in any kind of accident or collision. The windows were intact, the tires properly inflated, all systems functioning normally. Inside the car, David's personal belongings were still in their usual places. His wallet was in the glove compartment, containing his driver's license, credit cards, and $63 in cash. His thermos of coffee, still warm, sat in the cup holder. A half-eaten sandwich was wrapped in plastic on the dashboard, David's usual afternoon snack that Sarah packed for him every day. But there were disturbing anomalies that investigators couldn't explain. David's notepad, which he always kept meticulously organized, was missing several pages. The pages that remained contained fragments of notes in David's handwriting, license plate numbers, dates, and cryptic abbreviations that no one could decipher. Most puzzling of all was a small cassette tape that investigators found wedged under the driver's seat. The tape was labeled simply "Insurance" in David's handwriting, but when they played it, they heard only static. Technical analysis would later reveal that the tape had been deliberately erased using a powerful magnetic field, but not before something had been recorded on it. The crime scene team photographed everything, collected fingerprints, and bagged every piece of potential evidence. But for all their thoroughness, they were left with more questions than answers. How does a police officer simply vanish from his patrol car on a busy highway in broad daylight? Why would he leave his weapon behind? And what had happened to create a scene that looked both completely normal and utterly wrong at the same time? As dawn broke over the crime scene, investigators were forced to confront a chilling possibility. David Marshall hadn't simply disappeared. Someone had made him disappear. And whoever was responsible had been careful enough, clever enough, and powerful enough to pull it off without leaving a trace. The question wasn't just where David had gone. It was who had the ability and motivation to make a police officer vanish so completely that it was as if he had never existed at all. The disappearance of Officer David Marshall triggered the largest missing person investigation in the county's history. Within 48 hours, the scene had transformed from a local police matter into a multi-agency effort involving state police, FBI agents, and specialized search teams. Everyone understood that time was critical. If David was injured or being held against his will, every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding him alive. Captain Hayes coordinated the initial response, establishing a command center at the police station and organizing search teams to cover every square mile of the surrounding area. Bloodhounds were brought in to try to pick up David's scent from the abandoned patrol car, but the dogs seemed confused, circling the vehicle repeatedly before losing the trail entirely. It was as if David's scent simply vanished at the car door. The first major break seemed to come on day 3 of the investigation. A farmer named Carl Brennan called to report that he had seen a suspicious black sedan parked near the Henderson Bridge around 5:30 p.m. on the day David disappeared. The bridge was only 5 miles from where the patrol car was found, and Brennan distinctly remembered seeing 2 men in suits standing beside the vehicle. They looked out of place, Brennan told investigators. City types, wearing suits on a hot summer day, standing around like they were waiting for something. When they saw my truck coming, they got back in their car real quick and drove off toward town. This lead generated significant excitement among the investigation team. The timing was right, the location was relevant, and the behavior Brennan described was certainly suspicious. Investigators immediately began canvassing local businesses and gas stations, looking for anyone else who might have seen the black sedan or could provide additional details about its occupants. The lead seemed even more promising when Martha Collins, who worked at the First National Bank, came forward to report that she had seen a similar vehicle parked outside the bank that same afternoon. Collins remembered it specifically because the 2 men inside had been watching the bank's entrance for nearly an hour, which made her nervous enough to mention it to her supervisor. But as investigators dug deeper, the lead began to fall apart. Security camera footage from the bank showed no black sedan during the time period Collins described. When pressed for more details, Collins admitted that she might have been thinking of a different day entirely. Brennan, meanwhile, became less certain about the timing and description of the vehicle he had seen. The investigation team was learning a frustrating lesson that would repeat itself dozens of times over the coming months. In a case this unusual, every witness seemed to remember seeing something suspicious, but the details rarely held up under scrutiny. The second major lead came from an unexpected source. Detective Ray Morrison from the state police had been reviewing David's recent case files, looking for any indication that he might have been targeted by someone he had arrested or investigated. What Morrison found was troubling. 3 weeks before his disappearance, David had been asking questions about a series of truck thefts that had occurred throughout the region. The thefts themselves weren't unusual. Trucks carrying valuable cargo were often targeted by organized theft rings. But David had noticed a pattern that others had missed. All of the stolen trucks had been recovered within days of their theft, usually in remote locations with their cargo intact but their GPS tracking systems destroyed. David had theorized that the thefts weren't about the cargo at all. They were about using the trucks for some other purpose before abandoning them. Morrison's investigation revealed that David had been quietly gathering information about these thefts for weeks. even reaching out to law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties to see if they had experienced similar patterns. His notes suggested that he believed the truck thefts were connected to something much larger, possibly involving organized crime or drug trafficking. This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered that David had made contact with a federal DEA agent just days before his disappearance. Agent Patricia Wells confirmed that David had called her office with questions about drug trafficking routes through their area, specifically asking about the use of stolen vehicles in smuggling operations. He seemed to think he was onto something big, Wells told investigators. He was asking very specific questions about how smuggling operations work, what kind of protection they might have, and how local law enforcement officers might unknowingly interfere with federal investigations. The implications were chilling. Had David stumbled onto a major criminal operation? Was his disappearance connected to his investigation into the truck thefts, and if so, who else might be involved? But once again, promising leads led to dead ends. The FBI launched their own investigation into possible drug trafficking in the area, but found no evidence of organized criminal activity. The truck thefts had actually decreased since David's disappearance, suggesting that if there had been a connection, the operation had shut down permanently. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation team found themselves chasing shadows. Every tip led to another tip. Every theory spawned 3 more theories, and every potential breakthrough dissolved under closer examination. Witnesses contradicted themselves, evidence proved inconclusive, and the case began to take on the characteristics of an unsolvable puzzle. The most frustrating aspect for investigators was the complete absence of David himself. In most missing person cases, there are traces, abandoned personal belongings, witness sightings, credit card usage, something that indicates where the person went or what happened to them. But David Marshall had vanished so completely that it was as if he had never existed. By the 6-month mark, the active investigation had been scaled back. The command center was closed, the specialized search teams were reassigned, and the case was transferred to the detective division for long-term follow-up. Captain Hayes, who had led the initial response, would later describe it as the most frustrating case of his career. "We threw everything we had at this," he said years later. "Federal agents, state police, specialized units, hundreds of volunteers. We followed every lead, investigated every theory, searched every possible location, and at the end of it all, we knew less about what happened to David Marshall than we did on the day he disappeared." But the investigation was far from over. In fact, the most shocking revelations were still years away, waiting to be discovered by someone with the patience and determination to look beyond the obvious answers and dig deeper into the shadows where the real truth was hiding. As 1993 turned into 1994 and then 1995, the disappearance of Officer David Marshall began to fade from daily conversation in the small community. But it never truly went away. Like a wound that refuses to heal, the mystery left a permanent mark on everyone who had known David, and on the town itself. For Sarah Marshall, the passage of time brought no relief from the anguish of not knowing. In the months immediately following David's disappearance, she had clung to hope that he would somehow return, that there would be a reasonable explanation for what had happened. Maybe he had been injured and was suffering from amnesia. Maybe he had been kidnapped but would eventually escape or be rescued. Maybe it was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But as the months stretched into years, hope became a burden too heavy to carry. Sarah found herself trapped between grief and uncertainty, unable to properly mourn her husband because she didn't know if he was dead, but unable to move forward with her life because she couldn't accept that he was gone. The children, Emma and Michael, struggled in their own ways. Emma, who had been 7 when her father disappeared, developed severe anxiety and nightmares. She would wake up screaming that the bad men had come to take her away too. Michael, barely 4 at the time, gradually stopped asking when Daddy was coming home, but he would sometimes sit by the window for hours watching for a police car that would never arrive. The financial burden was crushing. David's life insurance policy wouldn't pay out without proof of death, leaving Sarah to support 2 young children on her part-time income from the local library. The community rallied around the family, organizing fundraisers and providing support, but charity couldn't replace the security and stability that David had provided. The police department struggled with its own trauma. David's empty desk became a constant reminder of their failure to protect one of their own. Some officers requested transfers to other departments, unable to cope with the daily reminder of the unsolved case. Others threw themselves into their work with renewed intensity, as if solving other crimes could somehow make up for their inability to solve the one that mattered most. Captain Hayes, who had led the initial investigation, found himself second-guessing every decision he had made. Should they have expanded the search area sooner? Should they have brought in federal investigators earlier? Should they have taken David's concerns about the truck thefts more seriously? The questions haunted him, and colleagues noticed that he was drinking more and sleeping less. The community itself was changed by David's disappearance. People who had once felt safe in their small town began locking their doors at night. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them go alone. There was an underlying sense that if a police officer could simply vanish without a trace, then no one was truly safe. Local businesses near the site where David's patrol car had been found reported a drop in customers. The stretch of Highway 67 became a place that people avoided, especially after dark. Some claimed they could still see the flashing lights of David's patrol car on foggy nights, as if his spirit was still trying to call for help. The case attracted attention from beyond the local community. True crime enthusiasts began making pilgrimages to the town, taking photographs of the police station and the stretch of highway where David had disappeared. A few amateur investigators set up websites dedicated to solving the case, proposing theories that ranged from the plausible to the bizarre. Every year on the anniversary of David's disappearance, the local newspaper would run a story asking for new information. The headline was always some variation of "David Marshall case remains unsolved," accompanied by the same photograph of David in his uniform, smiling confidently at the camera. These annual stories generated a few tips, but they invariably led nowhere. Television producers occasionally expressed interest in featuring the case on true crime shows, but the lack of concrete evidence or compelling leads made it difficult to create a compelling narrative. David Marshall's story had all the elements of a perfect mystery: a dedicated police officer, a baffling disappearance, and absolutely no answers. But without resolution or even promising theories, it remained a story without an ending. The most painful aspect for those who loved David was the gradual realization that the world was moving on without him. New officers joined the police force who had never known David Marshall. Children who had been born after his disappearance grew up hearing his name only as part of local legend. The urgency that had driven the initial investigation slowly gave way to resignation. But Sarah Marshall refused to let her husband's memory fade. She established the David Marshall Memorial Fund, which provided college scholarships for children of law enforcement officers. She spoke at police academy graduations, reminding new officers that their safety depended on looking out for each other. She organized annual candlelight vigils on the anniversary of David's disappearance, ensuring that the community would never completely forget. David believed in justice, Sarah would tell the gathered crowds each year. He believed that the truth always comes out eventually, even when it takes longer than we want. I have to believe that someday, somehow, we'll learn what happened to him. Until then, we keep his memory alive by continuing to seek the truth. What Sarah didn't know was that the truth was closer than anyone realized. Hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right perspective and the determination to look past the obvious answers, was evidence that would eventually crack the case wide open. But it would take nearly a decade and a fresh set of eyes to finally uncover the shocking reality of what had happened to Officer David Marshall on that summer evening in 1993. In 2003, 10 years after David Marshall's disappearance, Detective Lisa Chen was assigned to the cold case unit. Chen was known for her methodical approach and her ability to spot details that others had missed. When she inherited David's case file, she was struck by something that previous investigators had overlooked. The evidence from David's patrol car had never been fully processed using newer forensic techniques that had been developed since 1993. Chen decided to have the patrol car re-examined using modern crime scene technology. The vehicle had been stored in the police impound lot for a decade, gathering dust and serving as a painful reminder of the department's greatest failure. Most officers avoided even looking at it, but Chen saw it as a potential treasure trove of overlooked evidence. The re-examination began routinely enough. Chen's team used updated fingerprinting techniques, advanced chemical tests for trace evidence, and modern photography equipment to document every inch of the vehicle. For the first few days, they found nothing that hadn't been discovered in the original investigation. But on the fourth day, while using a new type of ultraviolet light to check for biological evidence, something extraordinary happened. Crime scene technician Robert Kim was examining the area behind the driver's seat when his UV light revealed something that had been invisible to previous investigators: faint handwriting on the plastic panel behind the seat. The writing was incredibly faint, visible only under specific lighting conditions and from a particular angle. It appeared to have been etched into the plastic using a sharp object, possibly a pen or small knife. Kim immediately called Chen over to examine the discovery. What they found changed everything. Scratched into the plastic in David Marshall's distinctive handwriting were 4 words that made Chen's blood run cold. "They know I know." Below that, in even fainter lettering, were what appeared to be initials, RH and BM. And beneath those initials was a series of numbers that looked like a date, 7/15/93, the day David had disappeared. Chen stared at the discovery for several minutes, her mind racing. David had somehow managed to scratch this message into his patrol car, presumably while he was in danger or knew he was about to be in danger. But who were RH and BM? What did David know that had put him in jeopardy? The investigation team immediately began working to identify the individuals behind the initials. Given the context of David's disappearance and his recent investigation into truck thefts, they assumed they were looking for criminals or suspects in whatever case David had been working on. But as Chen dug deeper into the case files, she made a connection that sent shockwaves through the entire department. RH weren't the initials of a criminal. They belonged to Captain Robert Hayes, the same Captain Hayes who had led the initial investigation into David's disappearance. The realization hit Chen like a physical blow. Captain Hayes, the man who had coordinated the search efforts and expressed such anguish over David's disappearance, was somehow connected to whatever David had discovered. But what about BM? Chen's investigation revealed that BM stood for Bill Morrison, the police department's evidence clerk. Morrison had been responsible for logging and storing evidence from various cases, including the truck thefts that David had been investigating. Morrison had retired in 1995, citing health problems, and had moved to Florida shortly afterward. The implications were staggering. David's message suggested that he had uncovered some kind of corruption or criminal activity involving high-ranking members of his own department. He had somehow learned that Hayes and Morrison were involved in something illegal, and that knowledge had cost him his life. Chen's team immediately began re-examining every aspect of the original investigation with this new perspective. They discovered a pattern of evidence that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. Morrison had been responsible for cataloging evidence from the truck theft cases, and several pieces of key evidence had mysteriously gone missing or been misfiled. Hayes had been the one to decide which leads were worth pursuing and which should be dropped. Most damning of all was the discovery that Hayes had been present at several locations on the day David disappeared, despite his claims that he had been at the station handling administrative duties. Cell phone records, which hadn't been thoroughly examined in 1993, showed that Hayes had been in the area near where David's patrol car was found around the time of the disappearance. Further investigation revealed the scope of the corruption. Hayes and Morrison had been working with a regional crime syndicate that specialized in using stolen trucks to transport drugs and other contraband. Their role was to ensure that any police investigations into truck thefts would be misdirected or abandoned. David had somehow discovered their involvement and had been planning to expose them. The cassette tape found in David's patrol car, the one that had been magnetically erased, now made sense. David had likely recorded evidence of the corruption, possibly a conversation with Hayes or Morrison. The erasure hadn't been the result of accident or equipment malfunction. It had been a deliberate attempt to destroy incriminating evidence. Chen realized that David's disappearance hadn't been a random crime or even a targeted hit by outside criminals. It had been an inside job, carried out by people David trusted, people who had sworn the same oath to protect and serve that David had taken. The discovery of David's hidden message was more than just a breakthrough in a cold case. It was proof that even in his final moments, David Marshall had remained a police officer determined to leave behind evidence that would eventually lead to justice. His scratched message wasn't just a cry for help. It was his final act of service, ensuring that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. But uncovering the truth was only the beginning. Now Chen faced the challenge of proving what had happened and bringing those responsible to justice. Even though one of the main suspects had been leading the investigation from the very beginning, the revelation of Captain Hayes' involvement in David Marshall, his disappearance, sent shockwaves through the police department and the entire community. Detective Chen's discovery had solved the mystery of what happened to David, but it had also exposed a level of corruption and betrayal that shook everyone's faith in the institution they had trusted to protect them. Hayes, confronted with the evidence, initially denied any involvement. But as Chen's investigation expanded, the web of corruption became impossible to ignore. Federal investigators were brought in to conduct a thorough review of the department's operations, and what they found was even more extensive than anyone had imagined. The truck theft ring that David had been investigating was just one part of a larger criminal enterprise. Hayes and Morrison had been providing protection for various illegal activities in exchange for substantial payments. They had manipulated evidence, misdirected investigations, and intimidated witnesses to protect their criminal partners. When David had started connecting the dots, Hayes had arranged to meet him on that fateful evening in July 1993. The confrontation had taken place at the remote location where David's patrol car was eventually found. According to the evidence Chen uncovered, Hayes had tried to convince David to look the other way in exchange for a share of the profits. David's response had been predictable to anyone who knew him. He had refused and threatened to expose the entire operation. That's when Hayes had made the fateful decision to eliminate the threat that David represented. The exact details of David's murder remained unclear, as Hayes continued to maintain his innocence even after being arrested. But federal investigators believed that David had been killed at the scene, and his body had been disposed of in a location that might never be found. The staging of the abandoned patrol car had been Hayes' attempt to make it appear that David had been the victim of unknown criminals. Bill Morrison, the former evidence clerk, was arrested at his retirement home in Florida. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of life in prison, Morrison agreed to cooperate with investigators. His testimony filled in many of the missing pieces of the puzzle, but it also revealed the true scope of the tragedy. Morrison confirmed that David had been murdered on Hayes' orders, but he claimed that he had only learned about it after the fact. According to Morrison, Hayes had panicked when David started asking questions and had acted without consulting his partners in the criminal enterprise. The decision to kill a police officer had been so reckless that it had effectively destroyed the entire operation. For Sarah Marshall, the revelation of what had happened to her husband brought a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. After 10 years of not knowing, she finally had answers. But those answers came with the devastating knowledge that David had been betrayed and murdered by people he had trusted, people who had pretended to search for him while knowing exactly what had happened. David always said that the worst criminals were the ones who wore badges, Sarah said during Hayes' trial. He used to worry that corruption was like a disease that could spread through a department if good officers didn't stand up against it. He died trying to do exactly that. The trial of Captain Hayes became a media sensation, drawing attention from across the country. The image of a decorated police captain being led away in handcuffs served as a stark reminder that corruption could exist at any level of law enforcement. Hayes was eventually convicted of murder, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Morrison, in exchange for his cooperation, received a lighter sentence of 20 years. But his testimony had helped convict not just Hayes, but several other individuals who had been part of the criminal network that David had died trying to expose. The scandal devastated the local police department. Several officers requested transfers, unable to continue working in an organization that had been so thoroughly compromised. The department underwent a complete reorganization, with new leadership brought in from outside agencies to rebuild trust and implement new oversight procedures. For the community, the revelation of the truth was almost as traumatic as David's original disappearance had been. The knowledge that their police department had been compromised for years, that criminals had been operating with protection from the very people who were supposed to stop them, shattered their sense of security. But there was also a sense of closure and even pride in David's memory. He had been vindicated as someone who had died doing his job, protecting his community from corruption and crime. The David Marshall Memorial Fund, which Sarah had established years earlier, received an outpouring of donations from people who wanted to honor his sacrifice. A memorial was erected at the site where David's patrol car had been found, bearing an inscription that read, "Officer David Marshall. He served with honor, integrity, and courage until his final day." Every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, the memorial is decorated with flowers and small American flags left by visitors who want to remember a police officer who died defending the principles he had sworn to uphold. The case also led to significant changes in how police departments handle internal investigations and corruption allegations. David's story became a cautionary tale taught in police academies across the country, reminding new officers that their greatest enemy might sometimes be found within their own ranks. But for those who loved David Marshall, no amount of justice or reform could truly heal the wound of his loss. Sarah never remarried, dedicating her life to preserving her husband's memory and advocating for police reform. Emma and Michael grew up knowing that their father had been a hero, but also carrying the burden of his tragic end. The discovery of David's hidden message had finally revealed the truth, but it had also confirmed everyone's worst fears about what had happened to him. In his final moments, David Marshall had remained a police officer, fighting against corruption and injustice even when he knew it would cost him his life. As we come to the end of this tragic story, we're left with questions that extend far beyond the fate of one police officer on a summer evening in 1993. The case of David Marshall forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, corruption, and the price of integrity in a world where doing the right thing can be deadly. David Marshall's story is remarkable not because of how it ended, but because of how he chose to face that ending. When confronted with corruption in his own department, he could have looked the other way. He could have accepted the bribes and become part of the system he had discovered. Instead, he chose to fight, knowing that his decision would put him in mortal danger. The fact that it took 10 years to discover the truth about David's disappearance raises troubling questions about how justice works, or fails to work, in our society. How many other cases remain unsolved because the very people investigating them are the ones responsible for the crimes? How many other David Marshalls have disappeared into silence, their voices silenced by those they trusted? But David's story also demonstrates the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up on the truth. Detective Lisa Chen's decision to re-examine old evidence with new technology ultimately cracked a case that had seemed impossible to solve. It's a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved if there are people willing to keep searching for answers. The corruption that David uncovered wasn't unique to his small-town police department. Similar scandals have been exposed in law enforcement agencies across the country, from small rural departments to major metropolitan forces. David's case serves as a warning about what can happen when good officers fail to speak up or when systems of oversight fail to function properly. For the Marshall family, the discovery of the truth brought closure but also renewed pain. Sarah, Emma, and Michael finally knew what had happened to David, but they also had to confront the reality that he had been murdered by people who had pretended to care about finding him. It's a betrayal that goes beyond the personal. It strikes at the heart of what law enforcement is supposed to represent. The changes that resulted from David's case, the departmental reforms, the new oversight procedures, the memorial fund that continues to support other law enforcement families, are his true legacy. In death, David Marshall accomplished what he had set out to do in life. He exposed corruption and helped make his community safer. But perhaps the most important lesson from David's story is that integrity cannot be compromised, even when the cost is ultimate. David Marshall knew that speaking out about corruption would put him in danger. He knew that powerful people would try to stop him. But he also knew that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of corruption. Today, when you drive past the memorial on Highway 67, you might see fresh flowers left by visitors who want to remember a police officer who died doing his job. The inscription on the memorial doesn't mention how David died or who killed him. It simply states that he served with honor, integrity, and courage until his final day. That's how David Marshall should be remembered. not as a victim of corruption, but as someone who fought against it. Not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of police work, but as an example of what it means to serve and protect even when those words carry the ultimate price. The patrol car that was found abandoned on that summer evening in 1993 was more than just a crime scene. It was a message from a police officer who refused to be silenced, who found a way to leave behind the evidence that would eventually bring his killers to justice. In scratching those 4 words into the plastic, "They know I know," David Marshall ensured that his voice would eventually be heard, even from beyond the grave. Justice for David Marshall came 10 years too late. But it came nonetheless, thanks to his own final act of service and the dedication of investigators who refused to let his case remain unsolved. In a world where corruption and injustice often seem to triumph, David Marshall's story reminds us that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried or how long it takes to find. The abandoned patrol car is gone now, released from the evidence lot and eventually sold at auction, but the truth it contained lives on, a testament to one officer's courage and a reminder that even in our darkest moments, justice is possible if we have the courage to seek it and the determination to never give up. David Marshall's watch ended on July 15, 1993, but his service to justice continues, inspiring others to stand up against corruption and fight for what's right, no matter the cost. That's the real story of the patrol car found abandoned in 1993. Not just what was found inside, but what it represented, the unbreakable spirit of a police officer who refused to be silenced, even in death.